All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Nick. I'm going to be the stat tutor for the guided study group lesson. So basically, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be going over a review of lesson one. Going to give you some of the most important terms, the stuff that you need to know, and then I'm going to give you some practice to, see, make sure that you've mastered all the information. So begin, we're going to start with cases and variables. So a case is an experimental unit from which data is collected. Meanwhile, a variable is a characteristic that is measured and can take on a different value, and it's basically something that can vary. That hence its name. So, for an example, a Penn State University teacher wants to know if their students who spend more time studying end up scoring higher in exams. So the students in this example would be the cases, and the variables would then be their score. So we have certain kinds of variables. So the first off, we have categorical and quantitative. So categorical are names or labels, and it can have a logical order or no logical order. On the other side, you have quantitative variables that are basically numerical values, that can be placed into a meaningful order. So you have discrete where it has a set value. So for instance, money, you can only really have like $1, $2, 50 cents. You can't really break it down, much more than that. However, for continuous, it could be something like, weight, where you could go all the way down, pounds, ounces, all the way down to, um, as small as the terms can go. So then you also have explanatory and response variables. So explanatory are basically independent from the experiment. So they explain the variations in the response variable in a study. Meanwhile, the response variables are dependent on what you do with the explanatory variable. And it's basically the outcome that you're measuring um, following the manipulation of the explanatory variable. So, for example, how does the hour spent studying affect exam grades? So, the hours spent studying would be the explanatory variable since that's what's varying, and the exam's grade is the response to the hours spent studying. All right, so next up we have samples and populations. So basically, the entire goal of STAT is to gather information from a subset of the population or a sample to make inferences about the entire population. So some very key vocab words are statistic, which is a measurement concerning a sample, or a parameter, which is a measurement concerning a population. Then you also have inferential statistics, which is basically the data that you use from a sample to make an inference about the population. Now, we have certain kinds of bias which can negatively affect the outcomes of our studies and experiments. So a representative sample is something that you use to try and decrease this. It's a subset of the population where they accurately reflect the actual population. And so, for instance, if you want to take a sample of Americans, then you're going to need a sample. For it to be a representative sample, you're going to need people from each state, from each religion, and from each political party that accurately reflect what the population is. And so there is always going to be this thing called bias, which is a systematic favoring of certain outcomes. And so it's negative in all experiments and samples. And so a specific kind is sampling bias, which is the systematic favoring of certain outcomes due to methods employed to obtain the sample. So we have sampling methods to try and get a sample for which we'll use to gather some of the statistical data. So some of the methods we have are simple random sampling, which is basically one of the best ways of sampling that we have. So it's a method of obtaining a sample from a population in which every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected, and the sample is selected without replacement. So basically what that means is it's completely random. You know, the person sitting next to you, or, you know, anyone in your stat class has an equal chance of being selected for a sample that pertains to your stat class. It's completely random whether they get picked or not. And so a convenience sampling is kind of the opposite of that. It's basically whatever is like the easiest to do. So for instance, if you're having a study and you just pick the first 10 people that like log into the SAT 200 class, then that would be a convenience sampling, and it would, end up having a bias on the outcome of the study, since you'd end up like gathering data from the first 10 people who came in rather than the entire population. So we have some sampling methods here, continuation of it. And so these are some of the biases that you want to try and crack down on. So you have a non-response bias, which is favoring a certain outcome that occurs when an individual can choose to participate in the study. So, for instance, I think one of the biggest examples of this are online reviews, because you're really only going to get a response from people who feel strongly, whether that's positively or negatively about it, and you're almost never going to see any neutral reviews. So if you were just to log on to Amazon and scroll down to any of the products, I'm willing to bet you that you'd see, like a very high percent of 5-star ratings saying, "Oh, it was amazing. Oh, it was so great. It was everything I hoped for." And you're going to see probably a few 1s or 2s saying, "Oh, it was awful. Who would ever buy this? Complete waste of money," stuff like that. But you're very rarely going to ever see any like 3-star reviews where it was just like, it's okay. And then you also have something called the response bias, where it's basically someone is favoring a certain outcome so the people don't really like respond truthfully in the study. So they're lying, or they're not giving the truthful answer. And it's either, to appease the researcher or to align with social norms or something like that. So, for instance, if it was a study over teenage drinking or a study over cheating given to students, chances are they're going to say that they've never cheated, they've never drank, stuff like that, even if it's completely anonymous, just because, they want to appease the researcher. So you also have other kinds of studies. You have an experimental study, which is, in the simplest way, a scientific study where a researcher is manipulating the treatment received by the subjects as a way to gather data. You also have an observational study, which is a study in which the researcher collects data without any manipulations. So basically, they're just going outside and observing something that happens. It can be something in nature. It can be, just like going out onto their front lawn and seeing who drives 45 miles per hour in a 35 zone or something like that. It's just observing what is around you without ever experimenting on it. And so with these is something known as the confounding variable. It's also called the third or the lurking variable. And so basically it's a characteristic that varies between cases, and it's related to both the explanatory and response variables, and can throw off the experiment. So you want to try and limit the confounding variables as much as possible. And then you also have more kinds of samples. You have independent and paired samples. So independent is where the cases in each group are unrelated to another. So, you could be asking a random sample of adults, what gender they identify as and how much water they drink. Not related in the slightest. Or you could be asking what's known as a paired sample. So it's cases in each group that are somehow matched. So, dependent samples, matched pairs, those are other words for it. And so, for instance, it's comparing midterm and final exam grades. Basically because, generally the better you do on the midterm, the better you're going to do on the final. That's just how it is. So, all right, and then we have these other things to try and narrow down the bias effects as much as possible. So we have something that is known as the control group, where that's basically they are a randomly selected group that does not receive any actual treatment. So they might be given a placebo or they might be given absolutely nothing at all. They are just there to gauge the effectiveness of the treatment or whatever they're experimenting with. So a placebo is something that appears to the participants to be the active treatment that another group is getting, but they're not, but it doesn't actually have any of the active treatment. So for instance, it could be a sugar pill. If they're testing out new surgeries, it could be a fake surgery. If they're testing out, new drugs that have to be injected into someone, then they're given fake injections. It's stuff like that. It has to be incredibly similar to the actual treatment to make people think that they are getting the actual treatment, but it has no active ingredient that would help them in any way, shape, or form. And it's really gauged to see whether or not the treatment or experiment is um, accurate in any way, shape, or form. And so then we have something that's also very important called blinding. So again, it's used to avoid bias. And so you have two real types of blinding effects. So you have the single blind study where one of the groups does not know which treatment they've been assigned. So for instance, the researchers know exactly who's getting what kind of treatment, and the people who are getting the treatment have no idea. So they could be getting either a sugar pill or an actual treatment pill. In a double-blind study, neither the participants nor the researchers know who is getting what. And so that's really used to cut down on bias the most, since the researchers can't then express any kind of bias of their own. And it can be incredibly useful when giving really any kind of experiment. So here we have some review questions. So I will let you read them and I will give you a few minutes to answer, and then I will go over it in a second. Okay, so the question asks, which of the following is most likely to be a confounding variable, given um, the three potential answers? And so the confounding variable is actually going to be age. And the reason being, in the question, they're only looking for they're only looking for the scores of the reading test compared to the scores of a math test. They're only looking for how reading test will then affect math test. That age does not matter at all in this experiment. It is just solely there to try and trip you up. So yeah, if you got it right, congratulations. All right, so question number 2. Again, I'll give you some time to read it and answer it, and then I will come back. Okay, so the answer to this is actually going to be random because since he's using Minitab Express, everyone has the exact same chance of being selected to participate in the study, and so all 50 of the students are just randomly selected. So we have this, so I'll give you some time to look at and choose an answer. All right, so the answer to this is going to be matched pairs because since the students are selected to take both and then the quizzes are compared, it's exactly like going back to the previous example of the midterm and the final exams. Since they've taken both, the scores are realistically going to be paired together since they're so similar. Right? So I'll give you guys another bit of time to finish this. All right, so this one goes back a little bit, so if you guys remember. So the preferred beverage is a categorical variable because it's simply asking them, do they like beer, wine, or water better? It's not asking anything about numbers. And the number of days exercising per week is quantitative because you gotta give a number of how many days you work out. There's all there really is to it. All right. Again, I'll let you guys have a little bit of time with this. This one's kind of a tricky one, so we'll see what you come up with. All right. So the answer to this is actually going to be non-response bias because the issue is that only 5 out of the 30 participated. So the other 25 might have had, something very valuable to say. However, they just didn't really feel as strongly about it. Those 5 that did respond most likely felt very strongly about it, or they're just weird. So it doesn't really reflect an accurate survey of how his reputation for his class is. Then that should be the last question. To let you guys have a little time with it. It's a little bit of a long one, so let's see what you guys can do. All right, guys. And the answers are all right. So the cases in this are going to be the students because all that really matters here, well, each, what they're really measuring, okay, sorry, it's the number of participants. And so the students are those participants that they are studying. And then the explanatory variable is the color of chalk. That is what's being manipulated by the teachers to see whether that does have some kind of effect. And then the response variable is how well they score. It's just comes down right to that. So, all right. Thank you for attending the session. The next one will be Sunday, August 26th at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. It'll be the same as this one. I hope to see you guys there. And if you have any questions, be sure to let me know. Thank you and have a good one.